to Nice Radio every Saturday at 7:30 a.m. for A View from the Outside, hosted by Brereton Horne. A View from the Outside takes a look at key issues affecting St. Vincent and the Grenadines and gives a global perspective on how these issues are viewed. Host Brereton Horne will examine a variety of topics to enlighten, stimulate debate, and explore solutions. Hear the facts, hear the real-life stories, hear A View from the Outside. Join Brereton Horne at 7:30 a.m. every Saturday on Nice Radio for A View from the Outside.
On A View from the Outside this week being the 30th of May 2020, we look at Wake Up Call. WAKEUPCALL. Wake Up Call. With this week's view taking the form of a question and asking, when will Vincentians recognize and act on the wake-up call? The Longman Dictionary defines wake-up call as an experience or event that shocks you and makes you realize that you must do something to change the situation. And the Cambridge Dictionary says, if something that happened is a wake-up call, it should make you realize that you need to take action to change a situation. Those definitions tell us that a wake-up call shocks you into knowing that your situation is not right and needs to change. A wake-up call is meant to jolt you into action. A wake-up call makes you realize that you must do something to change your circumstances. During this COVID-19 pandemic, with many countries around the world reeling from its effects and suffering severely, there are some leaders who have been shown to have acted irresponsibly and haphazardly in the way they have been handling the pandemic. The President of the United States of America has been categorized as one such leader and has been accused of putting politics and cronyism ahead of science. Former President Barack Obama described the president's handling of the crisis as an absolute chaotic disaster and a what's in it for me attitude. In his address to graduates on the seeming deficit of leadership, former President Obama urged the graduates to seize the initiative and to use the moment as a wake-up call as they chart their future. In much the same way, we, on A View from the Outside, have chosen to have a similar conversation with you, our Vincentian brothers and sisters. We've chosen to have that conversation with you today. And while this conversation is most apropos to those living at home in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, it is just as applicable to all those Vincentians living in the Vincentian diaspora. It is important that all Vincentians take stock and recognize the signs and not ignore their wake-up call. Many Vincentians have sat back, some in acquiescence, some in indifference, and others in silence, and allow the regime in St. Vincent and the Grenadines to systematically undermine and erode the rule of law in the country. Such undermining and eroding of the rule of law in most other countries will already have been the wake-up call effect change. They were allowed to introduce a repressive Grenadines tax, a tax which many say was to victimize and punish the people of the Grenadines for having continually and overwhelmingly rejected them at the polls. They were allowed to abolish PACE, that piece of legislation which was meant to protect citizens by regulating the behavior of the police during investigations. Many say that the police now behave in a most arbitrary way. Many say they treat some suspects in the most inhumane way. Many say that they need to be made accountable. The regime was allowed to sanction the physical and forcible manhandling of the opposition parliamentarians and throw them down the steps out of parliament, an incident in which one parliamentarian suffered a serious long-term injury. They were allowed to deny the opposition from bringing a motion of no confidence against the government, a ruling which is described as unparalleled in any constitutional democracy, and one which remains a stain on the democracy in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. They have been allowed to remarkably use the Constitution as a sword against the citizens of the country, a practice which the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court found unbelievable. They were allowed to amend the immigration laws, allegedly to provide protection for the agents who have allegedly been involved in immigration offenses, including the selling of passports. They were allowed to subvert justice by not allowing expedition in relation to the election petition, even when the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court ordered that the matter be dealt with expeditiously. It must be noted that those election petitions, which were lodged after the December 2015 elections to determine the legitimacy of the government, still languish in the court today, almost 5 years after those elections. Those instances and much more pertaining to the way the regime has eroded and undermined the rule of law in St. Vincent and the Grenadines ought to have been the wake-up call for many Vincentians. In addition to those instances directly pertaining to law, there are many more things which have occurred which ought to have served as the wake-up call. And so, the question is asked, when will your wake-up call come? When will you have your wake-up call? Will your wake-up call come when you remember how they got away with trying to deposit $1 million in cash in the Accountant General's account, the account of the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines? Will your wake-up call come when you remember how nothing was done in relation to the sexual assault and rape allegations of Michelle Andrews and Margaret Parsons and others against the head of the regime? Will your wake-up call come when you remember the scandal at the consulate in New York, when the Deputy Consul General was implicated in the allegations of selling passports and U.S. green cards, allegations which prompted Camilo Gonzalez, the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, when he stated that the Deputy Consul General acted inimical to the interests of the consulate and the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines? Will your wake-up call come when you remember the insults when industrious and hard-working Vincentians in New York were disparagingly and deprecatingly described as dog walkers and babysitters, and when others in New York were said to be living hand-to-mouth in cockroach-infested basements? Those very people are the ones who prop up the Vincentian economy with millions of dollars in remittance sent to their families and friends every year. Will that be your wake-up call when you remember? Will your wake-up call come with your memory of the inexplicable disappearance of Mr. Jocelyn, the servant of the Lord of Cane Garden, a man who, having been a fierce critic of the regime, disappeared without a trace, and for whom there has never been an official search or public inquiry into his disappearance? Will your wake-up call come when you remember the regime deducted millions of dollars of employees' national insurance contributions and deliberately did not pay those contributions over to the NIS? And then they turned around and took a loan from the NIS to pay back the NIS. Will that be your wake-up call when you remember? Will your wake-up call come when you remember the destruction of Yogi Farrell, that poor young woman who faced the wrath of the regime, its enablers, and the state machinery? Will that be your wake-up call? Will you have your wake-up call when you remember how Luzette King and others on the front line were arrested and treated purely for having exercised their fundamental human rights of freedom of expression and association? With Luzette King having her nakedness exposed to the world in a most debasing way? Will you have your wake-up call when you remember the preferential treatment given to Dave Ames and his dealings at Bukamar? Will your wake-up call come when you remember how Dave Ames was allowed to breach his bail and abscond the country while facing serious charges for fraud and tax evasion? Will your wake-up call come when you remember the glaring and palpable situation where justice in the country is seen as having two faces? A situation where it seems that there is one kind of justice for the poor and ordinary person and another kind of justice for the elite of the ruling class? Will your wake-up call come with your memory of when Arden Graham was arrested and charged and tried for sedition, when he prophesied that blood will run on the streets if the regime did not change? Will your wake-up call come when you ponder on the seeming arbitrary arrest of citizens, including Paul Ahmad Scrub and Joseph Bowen, who were arrested and charged and had their lives disrupted, only to have all the charges inexplicably discontinued against them? Will your wake-up call come with the recent arrest of Kenson King, who was arrested and released without charge? Will the issue of the regime's continuing failure and defiance to provide financial accountability to the Vincentian people be your wake-up call? As serious crimes, including murder, continue to escalate out of control, with 5 killings in 1 week, with the latest being that of an 11-year-old boy yesterday, will you let that be your wake-up call? With the increase in domestic violence, rape, sexual assault against women, and with women being continually targeted and destroyed in the most vicious and visceral way by agents and enablers of the regime, will that be your wake-up call? With the regime's practice of leaving roads, other infrastructure, including schools and clinics and public facilities, in disrepair until just before elections, be your wake-up call? Will the hardships which most Vincentian families and individuals face daily while others live in extravagance and opulence be your wake-up call? With a seemingly completely broken system and morality at an all-time low, will that be your wake-up call? Will the regime's emasculation of farmers and their deliberate and systematic stripping away of the financial independence of farmers be your wake-up call? Will the regime's acrimonious negotiations with some of the employers of Vincentian sailors returning home after those sailors have been stuck on cruise ships for weeks be your wake-up call? A situation which many say could well lead to many of the sailors not being re-employed by their cruise line. Will that be your wake-up call? With the general state of health care in the country being most unsatisfactory, where basic medication and supplies are constantly in short supply, will that be your wake-up call? Will your memory of the wastage of millions of dollars which were spent on the country poverty assessment and having never been provided with a report, will that be your wake-up call? Will the financial wastage and the environmental disaster of the failed geothermal project be your wake-up call? How about the recent fire in Union Island, which unfolded in a most terrible tragedy, where 3 people sadly lost their lives. Will that be your wake-up call? A situation where, from all reports, the inadequacy of the healthcare facilities, both in Union Island and at the Milton Cato Memorial Hospital, and the slow response of the emergency services did not give those three the best chance of survival. Will that be your wake-up call? A situation which exposed the country's inability to deal with emergency, even the inability to expedite access to emergency care overseas. Will that be your wake-up call? Vincentians, we, on A View from the Outside, can go on and cite many more instances which can be your wake-up call. However, we leave you continue the conversation. Identify the issues. Recognize your pain and the pain of others around you, as well as the pain of the nation. Identify the event. Acknowledge the situation, which is your wake-up call. Discuss them with your friends, colleagues, neighbors, and others. And as you do so, we encourage you to use your wake-up call to chart your future and the future of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. With the words of Stephen Covey, the late American educator, reverberating and echoing loudly throughout the country. He said, and I quote, "In the absence of wake-up calls, many of us never really confront the critical issues in life." I repeat that. In the absence of wake-up calls, many of us never really confront the critical issues of life, unquote. Vincentians, find that enough is enough moment. Find that wake-up call and confront the critical issues of life in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Until next week, Randy and all of the listeners, this is Brereton Horne with a reminder to send feedback to aviewfromtheoutside@hotmail.com. We also invite you to visit and like our Facebook page at A View From The Outside, and to visit and subscribe to our YouTube channel at JMB Horne. Have a pleasant Saturday, everyone. Have a wonderful Sunday, and have a productive week ahead. Looking, seeking, using the moment for your wake-up call. All the best to you, Randy, and the